Hey, ACAL, we are so excited to have Dr. Don Lynch with us today. Unfortunately, we couldn't have him physically, so we've got the next best thing going on. We've got him with us virtually. Hopefully over the next little while, we might be able to see if we can get Dr. Don on the shores of Australia, get him to, pat a kangaroo or something. It'll be lots of fun. Most of you, or many of you in the room here, would have come across Dr. Don's teachings, videos, blogs. He's a prolific writer, a great minister out of Jacksonville, Florida. But for those of you that don't know Dr. Don Lynch, Dr. Don and his wife, Ruth Ann, lead Freedom House in Jacksonville, a great apostolic church that is really, in many respects, championing this new era, this apostolic reformation, as it were. I don't know if we're in reformation yet, but really this restoration that's been going on. Dr. Don is a prolific author. Many of you, as well as I, would have read a number of his books. I wrote a couple that I read down here, which is Apostle, Fullness of Ecclesia, The Spirit and Power of Elijah, Spiritual Worship. Each of those books, are just rich, and we've had lots of dialogue. I know I've had lots of dialogues with many people. Coming across, if you haven't come across Dr. Don before, many of the really topics that is being championing in a significant way, we've been talking about the new era, fathering. I think that if you haven't as yet come across any of Dr. Don's teachings on fathering, I tell you, that's a really powerful aspect that he brings, and a real restoration of a healthy dynamic there. Ecclesia, of course, apostles and prophets, and then also kingdom culture and protocols. So, Dr. Don, we're so glad to have you with us, and really looking forward to just spending some time today listening to you really open up your heart and your thoughts about what God has for you and for the forum here. So, welcome, and glad to have you on board.
Thank you very much, and I am excited to be with you, David.
Thank you. ACAL, of course, is a coalition. We're not a network, so this is a coalition. Just so you know who you're speaking to in the room, there's a number of senior church leaders here, a number of key ministry people, of course, people that would be tracking at some degree in the apostolic and the prophetic. There's a number of network leaders here as well from all over the nation. We're in Sydney today, and this is day 2 of our summit. So we've just spent an entire day yesterday. We're in the deep waters of the summit in day 2, and again, really excited to just have you with us. I wonder, Dr. Don, obviously, as you knew you were coming on to spend some time with us, you've been saying some things. You've had some impressions about Australia, maybe what the Lord's sort of earmarking us for. Would you mind just sort of let's sort of start there and see where we go after that?
In context, I have been working in Brazil for 17 years as a representative of United States, and our nation, I believe, is a fathering nation.
Right. And
Brazil is becoming one. And for 17 years, I have been involved in watching that entire culture shift, and the shift of a predominantly Roman Catholic culture shifting to a almost 50-50 evangelical culture, which is changing every aspect of that nation, which is now the #1 missionary sending nation on the earth.
Wow.
During this last 3 years, God began to speak to me even before I met you, David. And God said to me, Australia will become a fathering nation. Its
Wow.
destiny is to be a leader among nations economically, but first of all, with a shift in its culture and a shift in the remnant or the kingdom of God in Australia, and that he would mature the apostolic and prophetic as a foundation for this shift. So I believe that you are coming into the 2020s with a mandate upon your nation, a mandate upon you as leaders to become a fathering people and a fathering culture, but also the spirit of fathering restored to your nation, somewhat like the idea that the days of Saul, King Saul, are over, and the time when David will take the ones no one wanted and turn them into mighty men.
Yeah.
There'll be a picture of kingdom, somewhat like that shift that will come in the spirit of leadership will shift, because Australia's destiny as a nation has been preserved and reserved, but hidden. It's now coming to light because God says, I have a remnant in Australia I can trust with the purpose of Australia and the purposes of other nations in that region.
Yeah, wow. Well, that's amazing. And so encouraging. And yeah, we, again, one of the things I didn't mention, was your work in Brazil, and I know that's quite extensive. And of course, we're all of us would have seen recently some of the culmination of some things. I don't think anybody here thinks that stadiums alone are going to be the strategy for taking nations, but nevertheless, to have the stadiums full, to have the president of the nation, on the stage there, probably speaks to more what's been building in the background. There's more work to do, of course.
Absolutely.
But I mean, what has been, I suppose, some of those learnings, working in Brazil, building in Brazil apostolically, what were some of the key markers for you that began to indicate to you that Brazil had come into some places of maturity from where it maybe was previously? What were some of those indicators that you could maybe?
The apostolic has been maturing more rapidly than the prophetic.
Okay.
We have basically 7, what I would call revival movements or reformation movements in the nation that are strongly apostolic in nature. And you have a consistent and intentional focus on discipling with a fathering anointing, that people are being brought into destiny. They're not accumulating believers, but they are maturing leaders. And these leaders are having impact on cities throughout the nation. Wow. In one city, Campo Grande, for example, when we came in and began to work with an apostolic leader with a territorial or a regional mandate and a leadership on his life, God shifted the city so powerfully, economically, socially, culturally, spiritually, that on one of the trips I returned, the mayor came and presented me with a plaque and said, we recognize that the difference in our city and region economically, which it's broken open economically, we recognize this is the work of God. This is an apostolic. He didn't use the word apostolic, but he used a word much like that, in which he said, the things that have been happening here spiritually and the authority of the church have changed our region. Thank you. And I accepted the plaque by saying, you can only thank me for obeying, because I came with the word of the Lord. But the people respond. And the markers, of course, are this passionate sense of purpose that rests upon people, powerful worship and intercession, and strong apostolic structure, not in a controlling manner, not a King Saul kind of structure, but a Davidic kind of passion where as I say to Brazilians, God will give you a weapon as big as your passion. And so the weapons of their warfare have been stolen from the giant, so to speak. God can only give them that weapon big enough by having the enemy, giving the enemy a giant so they'd make a weapon big enough for David. That kind of understanding that God has given Brazil destiny and purpose that came from other nations. And that this is one thing I would point out, is that Australia, God put the destiny and inheritances, spiritual inheritances of European nations and nations in other continents into Australia, because it's waiting for this time for a people who could awaken, a remnant that could awaken with a fathering anointing. Now he's going to send Australians back and awaken those nations and break them open like clay pots to reveal preserved purposes. So the things I've seen in Brazil, I know are coming to Australia, a place marked by worship, certainly, but a kind of ground roots, grassroots discipling that'll shift us from what I call the accumulation of believers to the maturing of leaders.
Yeah. One of the things that's so great, one of the things that last year at our ACAL summit, we had John Kelly, Apostle John Kelly from the ACAL. He was great. One of the things that he said, which I'd love if we could talk into a little bit, he said that many times the greatest warfare of a coming move or the forward thrust of the kingdom is the former wineskin or the current wineskin of the kingdom. I think about that in the sense for us here in Australia, whilst some of the language around, the thought of apostles or apostolic or even Reformation, some of that language, 10 years ago, if you said that, you were a rebel and had to hide in a corner, and pastors only talked about those things in quiet corners drinking coffee, whereas what we've seen a little bit more, whilst as yet we don't have, I think, the body of Christ in Australia fully embracing the reality of those, yet nevertheless, some of the language is now being adopted. And tragically, as a result of that, because we're still overwhelmed by evangelists, what's happened is that many are now calling evangelists apostles, and they're not apostles. But I suppose this thought about helping us to come through, because we're always coming out of a position, hopefully into a different or a more matured kingdom position. What would be some of those things? I mean, obviously you see it there in America as well, but what would be some of those things, even in your own congregation and with the people that you lead, that you've seen? Look, there's just some commonality if you're going to take people from point A to this, what God is announcing. What would be some of those things that just you go, look, you're going to have to deal with this, you're going to have to deal with that? What would be some of those things?
Yeah, structures are, the wineskins have become, something we love to talk about, old wineskins, new wineskins, and what structures look like. But I think we're going to have to be more radical. My latest book, 10 Things I'm Doing in the New Era. And number one, I am not looking for anything but the original design and definition of ekklesia as kingdom. So when I say structure, I begin with kingdom, and I expect ekklesia to come out of kingdom.
Right.
That's probably the first wineskin situation that I addressed more than 20 years ago. And then I began a kingdom center, kind of like the School of Tyrannus that Paul had in Ephesus, in which my focus again was not the accumulation of believers or what is normalized by church growthism, but the maturing of believers, which is more consistent with Great Commission thinking, more consistent with the model of Jesus, more consistent with fathering, and more consistent with kingdom culture. So we face in this generation, spiritual generation, the definition of the word church is going to be, that's going to be our battleground.
Right.
I grew up when the authority of the scriptures was very, very important, and we nearly lost the battle because the authority of scriptures has been in destruct mode and continues to be. And so I think we must return to that. What did Jesus mean when he said that word, or when Holy Spirit chose a Greek word, ekklesia, to communicate what Jesus was saying when he said in Matthew 16, Matthew 18, he referred to ekklesia? What was he saying? What was it that he is actually going to build? And if we measure it, as you said, the spiritual dynamics of that ekklesia will displace the strategically positioned authorities of his enemies. There will be a displacement of spiritual conditions in Australia when an authentic ekklesia is fully functional. So as I began to search that out and studied how what God was doing in Australia, in Brazil, and what God's doing in the United States in the apostolic restoration, if I apply that as I have been in my own mind to Australia, I see that God has a remnant people who are, very urgently, I think there's urgency that in the 2020s, they shift not just in thinking, but in structure. And by the structure, I mean from one culture, church entities culture,
Yeah.
to kingdom culture. And if you shift to kingdom culture, that radical move back to originality, back to original design and definition, will take all the elements of the apostolic restoration that are before us, all the things that have become a part of our verbiage and our practice. I believe we'll put it in a structure that will immediately cause it to gain a momentum unlike any that we have seen before.
Now, I've heard you, that's fantastic. I've heard you write and talk about Ecclesia at length, and I think you carry an ability to articulate that, the Ecclesia in a way that I've probably not heard anywhere in the earth at the moment. I think you're actually, undoubtedly you're commissioned as a teaching apostle to unpack that, I think, in a way that the church is going to be able to grab a hold of that functionally. But so I wonder, now again, I know again many here have, but maybe we might just camp for a moment around the whole thought of Ecclesia. And I know when someone says, hey, could you just, someone comes up to you, could you just take 2 minutes and unpack Ecclesia? It's like saying, take Mount Everest, and can you just scale that in a minute or two? But we've got a little more than a couple of minutes, and I just think it'd be a really important moment to maybe just, when you say Ecclesia, because sometimes you might say Ecclesia, and again, what I think that is may not necessarily be what you're saying. We're saying the same word, but it depends on where I'm coming from. So when you say Ecclesia, Dr. Don, unpack that for us in a little bit, because I get a sneaking suspicion that you're not talking, when you say Ecclesia, that you're not talking about the stone church on the corner of the street with the pastor and the 20 congregants that got a food parcel ministry to the city. I think you're talking about something else there. So what are you saying when you're saying Ecclesia?
I have seen one. I have seen some in session. So I do have something clearly in mind. Ekklesia, unfortunately, has gotten a poor translation simply because of the root ek and kaleo. For many years, decades, perhaps centuries, we have said ekklesia means called out.
Right.
And we've applied the idea to a people called out of darkness into light, which is not what ekklesia means at all. And no Greek would ever have assumed that called out was the meaning of ekklesia. They had other words for that kind of gathering and grouping. We also know that the Greek Septuagint version of the Old Testament, when ekklesia is used, even then it refers not to the congregation of the people, but to any time the people were called before the Lord. Wow. To appear before God in order to stand in between heaven and earth as his remnant people. So when we say ecclesia, when we hear Jesus say ecclesia, we are not saying the same thing because of the word church, which undoubtedly is a horrible translation of that term when given to us to force our minds toward a stone church, as you said, with the idea that here's something that belongs to God, that belongs to the Lord. Mm-hmm. And we say the building belongs to the Lord, this is special, this. All that happened when that occurred moved us away from the meaning of ecclesia, which is a kingdom word. The word ek is directional. It's a directional preposition. So it really means from point of origin with the idea of destination. Okay. And so ekkaleo, called out, really means called into, as ek can often mean. And so what an ecclesia was called from a kingdom, from a polis or a Greek city region's a better word. The ecclesia were called from within the kingdom to assemble together in order to conduct governmental, legislative, and judicial business to represent the entire region. Right. It was structured so that there were leaders, of course, who called it together and gave and gave direction to it, and then carried out administratively what the ecclesia determined. But an ecclesia always meant a governmental body, a group of people, and Jesus makes then this completely clear. He says, I'm going to build my ecclesia. It's going to displace by the strategically placed enemies. I give you kingdom keys. So, I mean, he has no context except kingdom in Matthew 16, and in Matthew 18 has no context except kingdom culture, because he says entire ecclesia applies to a breach of citizen-to-citizen relationship.
Right.
Jesus is assuming kingdom. Unfortunately, we took ecclesia out of kingdom. We took kingdom out of ecclesia.
Right.
And now today, we're in my nation, we have a problem where if you say the word marriage, it can mean anything you want it to mean. And unfortunately, we're nearly there with the word church. In that if you say church, it can mean anything you want it to mean. Or theologians even saying the word church came to mean, ecclesia came to mean something. I don't know of any Bible word that came to mean something. It means exactly what it meant when it came out of the mouth or was written down by the author. It means what God intended, the Holy Spirit intended it to mean at that time. Yeah. And ecclesia means out of the kingdom, prepared and positioned, brought into maturity and functional integrity, building body bride, coming together to represent heaven on earth with the authority to change prevailing spiritual conditions and establish the influence of God in a culture. Yeah. So that kingdom makes such an impact that heaven and the influence of heaven becomes more dominant than any other prevailing spiritual condition.
Right. Yeah. So would you say then, are you saying that each nation, in each nation, there's an ecclesia that you would say this is the ecclesia in the nation? And then would you say, and then there are ecclesias that are in regions? Like just help us grab a hold of some handles here.
Absolutely, because then we get this discussion of the universal church, the local church, the regional right. church,
right?
And so when you go to kingdom is of course spiritual, yeah. And kingdom is a reality in heaven that becomes a reality in the earth. So you can have an ecclesia called together and have a national assembly. Okay. If you have apostolic leaders who can call together from that metron or that scope of leadership, you can call together regional. In terms of territorial would be better, and then regional. I personally think regional is the smallest because of the nature of the word polis, or what a polis really represents. So the metaphor Jesus uses gates, and that's why I say a polis is the gates where the authorities sat. They determined the structure of the rest of the wall, and the gates were designed as the entry points of certain economic and cultural aspects of the entire region. But it represented a whole group of people who then would come into the walls in order to participate in that regional purpose, or the regional joining, the cultural aspect of that region. So we could have an ecclesia that's regional. We could have an ecclesia that's territorial. We could have an ecclesia that's national or international, in that when it assembles, it deals with issues at the level of its metron, or its authority, and delegated authority from the King of Kings. Yeah. Most of what we call churches, I would identify as kingdom ministries. So I would say that most of the things we call a church are actually kingdom ministries that contribute to a kingdom culture in a region, and from within them, the preparation and positioning of individual citizens would provide us in that region to call together an ecclesia that was representing the purpose of God for that place. God has a people who represent his purpose in that place. And when they establish that purpose, and as they do so, a greater manifestation of God's glory becomes available.
So coming then, that's a great, a great just span there. So coming back to this thought then that says that most of the warfare of the thing that is coming, or the thing that is, usually comes out of the thing that we know, and so what we know in general, I'm sure it'll be the same in the States. We know local church, as we have defined it. We know denominations. We know groups that have distinguished themselves by the denominators of particular emphasis. So we know those. We know fraternals, this thought of fraternals. And we know even, I suppose now probably a little more, even more recent, we also know the thought of unity movements, you know. So these are the things that we know. And I'm sensing here as you're talking about what the Ecclesia, from, again, going back to the biblical definition, and because we want to go back to that level, I kind of feel like what we know and what that is, there's a variance. That is not this. And I suppose the $1 million question for the church is, for many in the church and many leaders in the church, is how do we then, having the sense of this blueprint, this design, the original design, how are we going to go from where we are? And it doesn't, for me, already as a strategist, I go, gee, that there sounds like there's some pain, there's some unlearning, there's some things, even some dismantling, which is kind of scary in some respects. To migrate to this other thing, I would say, Dr. John, that one of the things that we found here in this nation, and I'm sure you would have found it also, was that when the apostolic message really began to, I suppose, hit the shores of Australia, which would have been the late 1990s, early 2000s, it came with quite a sort of a move. I think some champions of that would have been Dr. Peter Wagner, Dutch Sheets, Cindy Jacobs. Some of these people really came and were heralding this, and it was embraced with, obviously, some loving this thing, some, okay, curious, and then others resisting. But some of the ones that loved it, what we saw, Dr. Don, was almost like a fire sale of everything that they, trying to sort of, that's it. At that point, there was a thing where it was like, okay, pastors no longer matter. It's all about apostles. It's almost like, let's forget all the other four fivefold ministries. It's just apostles. And but a number of very zealous people embraced this new thing and said, right, that's it. Everything else now, we just kill it. And we're on this thing. And I've got to say to you that the evidence of that sort of behavior was a lot of shipwrecks, and nothing really, no one really built anything of significance as a result of that. And what it did do is it scared a lot of ministers, and it scared a lot of people. And they said that apostolic message is troublesome. It'll blow up everything. And then, 10 years later, we had, unfortunately, the whole boogeyman of the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation. Anything that was crazy was thrown into that bucket. And anytime you said apostle or apostolic, you were one of these NAR. It was like the Illuminati of the church, And as a result of it, for many, it justified their prejudices. But so I know that you're not, what we're suggesting here, we're not advocating this thought that just goes, okay, everything gets a fire sale. Like, there's got to be some sort of a journey, a migration from where we are to where we're going. Do you see it that way, or do you see it differently?
Oh, no, I see it that way. Wineskins causing me to smile because of that. But, Jesus was very clear that he didn't want to put new wine into an old wineskin because he didn't want to destroy the old wineskin. Right. He doesn't want to destroy either wineskin. He doesn't want any old or new wine to be wasted. That was his whole consideration. I think we've taken that metaphor a little bit too far, right, and exaggerated it. Obviously, God's not interested in destroying everything. He's called people. People have done wonderful things. Yep. People have been born again. Yep. All the things that of the kingdom have been there, but what we have lacked is the proper order or foundation. Remember that the apostolic restoration, we go back to Ephesians 2:20, apostles and prophets are foundational. Yeah. But they haven't functioned at the foundations. We haven't gone back to the foundations and inserted the function, not the title, but the function at the apostolic of the foundational level. And what I've seen and believe is that without kingdom culture, you cannot have apostolic order. Without apostolic order, you can't have the restored ecclesia.
Right.
You have to have a kingdom culture, because apostolic order doesn't function without an apostolic order. You can't lead people as an apostle until the people are apostolic. You have to make an apostolic people.
Right.
You can't lead a prophetic people, and as a prophet, you need prophetic people. So the process is not fixing the title and the leadership as much as it is transforming the entire culture so that the people are properly prepared and positioned, as Ephesians 4:11 says, the fivefold aspects of Jesus' leadership will do.
Right.
And the honor that we bestow on each of those leaders reveals that we agree with the King, and the honor that people give to those leaders because they are functionally turning those people into mature believers, again, is honor to the King. And all the aspects of oneness, unity, all the aspects you just mentioned are all there in Ephesians chapter 4. And they describe how Jesus is represented in the earth by building body and bride. Of course, building body and bride are metaphors themselves, and we exaggerate those metaphors.
Sure.
See, when I say building body and bride, I'm not a brick, I'm not a kidney, and I'm not the adornment of a bride. Those are metaphoric. But when I say kingdom, that's reality. There's no metaphor there. Jesus is king, and there's a kingdom in heaven that can then, and is real now spiritually in the earth, influencing the natural through spiritual means. So if we go back to kingdom culture, we understand that kingdom's here. It's been reset by Jesus, that he's going to have not one remnant nation, but many remnant nations.
Right. And
that the culture of those nations will be shifted, that we will disciple cultures by individual life change denoted by baptism. And then he says, and train them to obey all I've commanded you. And I'll be with you all the time you're doing this until the time reaches its ultimate. Right. This is the commission that restated the cultural mandate God gave Adam, because Jesus came to produce what the Father wants in a totally different way. Instead of beginning natural to manifest spiritual, he began with spiritual to manifest natural. So it's spiritual influence that's going to get the Father what he wants in every nation on the earth. And Jesus accepted responsibility to make it happen. And now he has called us to be representatives of his. So almost everything that you mentioned in terms of unity, which I would say unity is not our goal, but oneness. Yeah. And there's a difference, because one can be created by man, but oneness can only be created spirit with spirit with spirit with spirit. Yeah. So in other words, we go back to thinking the way God thinks in the scriptures. And if we stop, I hope this is not too strong, hammering the apostolic restoration into church growthism to make it fit our current thinking. Yeah. If we go back to kingdom and less about church growthism's assumption that success is the accumulation of believers, we go back to producing mature kingdom citizens, we'll have a kingdom culture and an apostolic order, which simply means that somebody has blueprints given to him by the king to represent the king and say, this is what I want, and here's a strategy to get it. This doesn't destroy legitimate ministries. Right, right. It will sift the present ministries, because some of them are not legitimate. Yeah, sure. And they really don't have a divine reason to exist other than they're just mad or on an ego trip. And sure. One of the things that the apostolic order will do is say, that's not of God. Then the authentic remnant will then be infused with the fullness of God in the fullness of time, and then we'll see the fullness of ecclesia. Yeah.
So what I'm hearing you, that's brilliant. What I'm hearing you say there then, is that, because I'm trying to think about for us in the room here, as some of us obviously are going to return after this summit back to leading, local churches, and then obviously being a part of the church in the city and different regions and all the rest. That what I'm hearing, I suppose you say, Dr. John, here is that one of the most important things to begin with, if we go, well, where would we begin? How do we begin this? Not that we're at the beginning, but one of the imperatives there is, because I think what's happened, and maybe it's an ego thing, that a lot of the time when something like this is happening, sort of God is opening up a new era or whatever, we tend to run, and everybody starts to try and grab a hold of, well, what's my title now, and we start to get the business cards changed, but in some respects you say no, hang on, before any of that, and not that that's great anyway, but before any of that, let's get back to this thought about what is kingdom culture and what is kingdom protocols, because we ourselves can begin to migrate into those. We can begin to help the people that we lead migrate into kingdom culture and kingdom protocols. And as that begins to take root, as the environment of that, then the leadership, there's a place there, as it were, for then apostles and prophets, as it were, to begin to function, because they're not necessarily trying to speak to an evangelistic pastoral people that are conditioned that way. And all of a sudden, I know that there's been some pushback with some of the saints that have been so conditioned to hear the voice of, or even the grace of a pastor. And then all of a sudden, the moment you hear an apostle, it's a different experience. Yes. And some might say, well, that man or that woman, for whatever, doesn't make me feel as comfortable, doesn't, I don't feel, I was going to say, the kisses of Jesus on my mouth after he speaks. It feels like I've been actually given a bit of a shove, and go, it's a different grace. And, and it does, it's an adjustment. It really, it's an adjustment. So I suppose I'm hearing, what I'm hearing here is to go, well, look, before you change the sign on the church or change your business card, how about we begin to, within the context of, whatever we're operating in, begin to re-engage strongly with kingdom culture, kingdom protocols, the way that God or the Bible defines how the king wants it. And as we do that, then the issue or the point of leadership rising that is more apostolic, prophetic, there'll be less resistance. Not that there won't be resistance, but less, because actually the environment is conditioned towards that, rather than going, let's just change this. And then now I was your pastor, but tomorrow I'm now your apostle or your prophet, and I'm going to lead you that way. And, I think in some respects, not have that train wreck. Because the other thing, I suppose, that I can say, we wouldn't be in this summit if we weren't aspirational about apostolic order.
Right.
Because ultimately we want that, because we know that's the glory that transforms nations. And so we ultimately want that. But I think in some respects, it's how do we build accordingly without getting step 3 in before step 2. And so there's a wisdom, isn't there, in some respects, of how we build this thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's why I didn't start, Freedom House itself is an international ministry that functions as the kingdom center. Yeah. And our influence has been in many nations, more than 30 nations right now, as a small footprint. We're not a mega church, in other words, but we have influence much larger, we have more influence perhaps than some mega churches. Right. What I mean by that is that we train people to function at an international level. So what we shift, when we shift from where we are to where we need to be, always begins with remnants. God always, he wants everybody, but he never starts with everybody. He always starts with a remnant. He wants all the nations, but he doesn't start with all the nations. He starts with remnant nations, of which Australia is now a remnant nation. And what God does is he puts into the remnant what he wants everybody else to have. Puts in remnant people what he wants all people to have. He puts in remnant leaders what he wants all leaders to have. Puts into remnant nations what he wants all remnant all nations to have. He puts in remnant ministries what he wants all ministries to have. Yeah. And so there is a remnant. And certainly some of the people that I'm talking to right now, you're remnant leaders. Yeah. You're pioneering leaders. You are different, and you're paying a price for that in the sense that you feel as if I don't fit in what is because I'm more in tune with what is coming next. And you've already lived through that. But if we're good at this, in other words, if this is where the grace flow comes, is this where the spiritual momentum rests, we won't have to destroy what is as much as we'll have to displace it. We'll have to, we'll continue to work with the shepherding leaders, evangelists, and teachers, and not ignore them or dismiss them or diminish them, because they all function much more powerfully and effectively when they are functioning in an apostolic structure, in the proper apostolic order. Shepherds have a more powerful ministry. Here in the United States, thousands leave the ministry every month because of the pressures of false expectations that come from this idea of that the accumulation of believers is the definition of success. You know, the side that really produces loyalty and the kind of oneness and the kind of camaraderie that people are looking for in leadership and ministry, like David produced in his mighty men, comes from investing yourself in a fathering spirit in people as a shepherd, as an evangel, as a teacher, as a prophet, as an apostle. So there is a process we move through, and it begins with a remnant. Somebody has to get it right. Somebody has to start like Paul did with the school of Tyrannus and say, this is how it needs to be done. And when he did, then the impact of Ephesus on all of Asia Minor, and then literally on the entire kingdom, because Ephesus became the center of Christianity for 200 years. What happened there was a remnant movement that shifted the whole kingdom again, in the same way Jesus had reset it at the ascension.
Yeah, I think that Acts 19 is a powerful template of what we're talking about, and wonderful. We've got a couple of minutes left, Dr. Don. I wonder if there might be. I mean, I could talk to you for hours, and we will. Great. You know, I'm going to fly to Jacksonville. We'll have coffee. Not great coffee because it's America, unfortunately, but a
lot of truth to that, my friend. A lot of truth.
But I wonder, just some last thoughts. You know, you've said a lot about the Roaring 20s. You know, there's some wonderful days ahead, I believe, for the church, for kingdom leaders. What would be a couple of thoughts that you know, by way of encouragement, or just, you know, some things that you might want to just sort of share with the room and these leaders before we sign off?
I have seen what we have prophesied with my own eyes in Brazil and other nations. It is far too late to convince me that God is not doing something new in the earth, unlike anything we've ever seen before. We are in the greatest decade of history. God has been leading up to this since Wigglesworth prophesied that Australia, the great move of God, one of the greatest moves of God in the last days would come in Australia. He anticipated this time. We're in it now. And it's the Roaring 20s, which in the United States was the 1920s, marked by a specific sound. When you put a scroll in a player piano, and that was the mark of us. There's a new sound in Australia. It's not the old sound. It's a spiritual sound that's going to awaken the land. It's going to awaken you as pioneering leaders to have more of an affinity with the land, so that you understand the purpose of the land. Because the glory of God for Australia the land responds. There's a sound, and the glory of God responds to that specific sound. There's going to be a shift in intercession and worship so that they blend together, and you won't be able to tell the difference between them. They'll be effective. And you'll find yourself wanting to be a father, not to successors, because I don't believe you're looking for successors. You're looking for inheritors. If you shift your leadership more to a fathering spirit, you'll find that you're in your life's work. The greatest days of your life are in front of you, and that you will find more satisfaction in watching spiritual inheritors do what you do now than doing it yourself. And you will find that you will set your hand to right. And I wanted to say this specifically to you leaders. you should be writing in this season. Australia's greatest days are now, and God knew that you would be alive in Australia right now. So God is saying, I have a people, I have a remnant. Let the passion of the Father for those purposes burn up and consume everything else in your life. And you'll find yourself living with great joy, great delight, living the dream, as we say.
Yeah.
And David, I'm telling you that I know Australia is marked by God.
Yeah, amen, amen. That's fantastic. It's fantastic. That felt more like a prayer, and we receive it as a apostolic declaration, as a prophecy, as a prayer from you. And Dr. Don, we are so thankful for your time today, and really appreciate all that you are doing as a Vanguard leader globally, really. And I pray, I pray that we will see you on our shores very soon, at some point in the near future. And also too, that for us, that there would be continued cross-pollination, together. So again, thank you so much for your time on behalf of the delegates here. We're going to take what was said, and we're going to take it really seriously, and send back some reports to you. I'm a feedback kind of guy, so we'd love to just keep tracking with you. And if you don't, of course, I'm just going to say to the guys, if you don't as yet follow Dr. Don on social media, if you haven't yet visited his website, all those details are going to be available. So thanks again, Dr. Don, and we'll see you next time. Bless you.
Thank you, my friend.